Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. I'm Carolyn Jacobs with GBH Education. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is the fifth in a series of 6 webinars that we've been running over the last few weeks. The last one is this coming Thursday, all around the collection of resources on PBS Learning Media called Bringing the Universe to America's Classrooms. And this one is in particular for EL educators of grades K-5. And the one that will happen on Thursday is for educators of grades 6-12 EL students of science. So we are recording tonight. We are using Zoom webinar as our platform. Only the presenters have the microphone and the camera. We will be sending out the recording link tomorrow, along with a document that is all the resources that we're showcasing tonight, links on that, a resource document, along with the links to the slides and a link to a survey. And we have Angelica in the chat from GBH Education, who will be posting links as we proceed. And she will keep up and kind of post things in order, but she'll also post the link to the document, the resource document that gives you everything. This session is sponsored by GBH Education, Boston's PBS station, and the producer of many of the iconic programs that you see on your local PBS stations around the country. Nova, Masterpiece, American Experience, Frontline, etc., and lots of kids programs are created at GBH and then disseminated throughout the public media system. We're also sponsored by PBS Learning Media, and I hope lots of you are already familiar with PBS Learning Media. This is a free site. It offers thousands of digital resources for K-12 across the curriculum, all aligned to standards, ready for classroom. With lots of support materials that go along with the media to help you really enrich lessons. The collection, a lot of the resources we're going to be showing you this evening are from a collection that I mentioned, Bringing the Universe to America's Classrooms, and that collection lives on PBS Learning Media. So this is your go-to site for everything that you see this evening. Our presenters this evening, the main presenter is Sean Stevens, who is the Director of STEM Curriculum Instruction here at GBH Education. And we are joined by 2 wonderful educators, one of whom we've worked with for about 5 years, Annie Venegas, who from New Rochelle, New York, an elementary teacher. Annie has been one of the teacher advisors on the Bringing the Universe to America's Classrooms project since the onset, and we're thrilled to have her with us. And Ryan Johnson, who is a relatively new teacher advisor with us. He's been working with us over the last year, I believe, and that's when we brought in specifically some EL teacher advisors to just keep us authentic and make sure that what we're producing is really relevant for teachers. So welcome to both of you. The plan this evening is Sean is going to kick things off for about the first half of the webinar. We will be ending at 8 o'clock Eastern time or a little bit sooner. And she will have an introduction to the collection that I've mentioned of our science resources. This is a project that is a collaboration with NASA, and Sean will go into that a little bit. And then she'll go into the research of the design principles for working with EL students. Then Annie will come on and give us an example of a classroom story and the way she has used one of the resources with her students. And Ryan will do the same, and then I'll come back on for a few closing remarks. So I'm going to turn things over to Sean.
Thanks, Carolyn. Okay, so first I'm just going to give a little background on the project, Bringing the Universe to America's Classroom, finally noted called BUAC by some of us in case we slip and call it its nickname. This project is a collaboration with NASA and affiliated organizations, as well as dozens of teacher advisors from across the country who worked with us to help make sure the resources that we developed would be useful for you. These resources are meant to help K-12 students meet important learning goals related to earth, space, and physical science. If you actually go to the collection, you won't find a full curriculum or unit, but supplementary resources. And these were designed to be flexible and adaptable so they could be used in multiple ways and fit into multiple curricula. Next slide, please. So our goal in developing these resources was to change from the standard explanatory mode where there's an expert telling students something about a phenomenon, and instead giving students the opportunity to actually engage with the phenomena, make their own observations, look for evidence to support claims, use models to explain and make predictions about phenomena. Please advance. So really our goal was to provide opportunities for students to figure stuff out, not tell them stuff about phenomena. So this is really consistent with NGSS. Next slide, please. So although these resources are supplementary, they still come with a lot of supports. The project needed to be 508 compliant, so there are a lot of accessibility features. The handouts and interactive lessons are screen reader compatible. All images have descriptions, all videos have closed captioning. We're in the process of translating all of the student-facing resources into Spanish, and so that'll be both the handouts and the media whenever possible. If you see that little gold badge up in the thanks, Carolyn, that says also NES, that's an indicator that it's available in Spanish. And that's not just in this collection, but throughout all of PBS Learning Media. There are support materials to help you integrate these resources into your classroom. So there's background about the content as well as the media to make sure you're comfortable with the resource, and some potential discussion questions and ideas about how to integrate it with your curriculum. For the students, there are often handouts. And for the K2 grade band, most of the resources also come with activities that are associated with them. One thing about these resources that teachers always ask is, yes, they are assignable. You can assign them to directly to your students through PBS Learning Media, but also Google Classroom, Schoology, Canvas, Nearpod. Angelica will put the link in. And you can go to our help site and see whether the software you use is compatible. Next slide, please. So now we'll dig more into the supports for English learners. We've been really lucky to have worked with some great advisors, world-class advisors as far as supporting English learning in science. And throughout the project, we worked with them to develop strategies that informed all of our materials and that would be beneficial not just to EL students, but all students. In particular, we focused on making learning active for students with plenty of opportunity to talk and make sense of both the science phenomena and the media. And provided opportunities for students to express their ideas in multiple ways. Next slide, please. There are two major components to our supports for English learners. The first one I mentioned earlier, the Spanish translations of the resources, and the other are specific supports for English learners that usually accompany our lesson plans. And these supports were designed around the science learning that we wanted students to do. So they help students interpret and make sense of and communicate about the media, as well as help them meet the science learning goals that we're trying to get all students to reach. So they're not meant to be separate ELA type of goals, but all integrated in with learning the science. Next slide, please. Some of the types of supports we have, visual vocabulary, which teachers tend to like even for all students and find that really valuable. Suggestions for hand gestures that you could use to communicate certain terms and help students make those connections. For any student, English learner or not, that needs a little extra support, we have versions of handouts with sentence starters or sentence frames and word banks that give students just that little bit of help if they need it in order to communicate their ideas. There are also just some general supports that are useful when working with English learners. The videos in particular, as I said, all our videos are captioned. And so once they're translated, they have the choice of English or Spanish, and you can toggle them on or off. But maybe most importantly, people often miss that you can adjust the speed of the video. And by slowing it down just a little bit, and finding that sweet spot where it's a little slower but not distorted, can really help give your brain just that little instant more to be making sense of what's going on. And this could be useful for all students, but particularly English learners. I know I do it because sometimes things just go too fast and I have to slow it down so I can figure out what's going on, and I find it really helpful. Next slide, please. So I'm not an expert in supporting English learners in learning science, but I'm really excited about it. And when I took this workshop, I learned about these design principles for engaging multilingual learners in three-dimensional science. I found it a really useful workshop that really made me reflect and think about our approaches to supporting English learners in a new way, and kind of think about what we do well and how we could improve. So I was really excited about it, and so I wanted to share, and so I volunteered to do this. So I hope that as we talk about this, that you have a similar type of experience. So this report was a joint effort between NSTA and WIDA, which is a group of states that's dedicated, that works together as a consortium and is dedicated to advancing the academic development and academic achievement of youth and children who are culturally and linguistically diverse. And they work on developing high quality standards, assessments, doing educational research, and developing professional learning for educators. Next slide, please. The foundation of their suggestions, or their principles, is the idea that science and language instruction must be integrated. So it's important to engage English learners in those same meaningful learning experiences that all students should have, so that they're engaging in authentic practices and having meaningful interactions with their peers as well as their teachers. So we don't have separate language learning objectives, but it's all integrated, and they'll be developing language proficiency while they're learning the science. Next slide, please. So there are 8 design principles that they propose, and they divide them into 3 categories: foundational, the 4 pillars for sense making, and then equity for multilingual learners. So we'll talk about each one of these categories individually. So next slide, please. So the first one is kind of the basic tenet for defining science literacy, is that students will learn to explain the world around them and develop into informed citizens who can both understand and potentially help address issues that are important to their lives and society. And this is all students, not just some, but even English learners. And then the design principle 2 is really focuses more on the diversity side and recognizes the history of disparities in science and has faith that it can be disrupted. And by doing this, we can do this by considering teaching and learning science from multiple perspectives, recognize that historically, who does science, who knows science, and how we know what we know, there has been an intrinsic bias to that. And one of the our recent products in for BUAC is a framework that addresses diversity and equity for science education media. We made a teacher's guide for that, a version of that, and you can download it if you're interested. And this addresses a lot of these first 2 design principles and goes beyond that too. Next slide, please. So now the next category is the 4 pillars of sense making. And these are going to look kind of familiar. The phenomena that should be driving instruction and anchoring what students are working to investigate and to explain. The idea that students' contributions matter, that that instruction should center around students' questions as they work together to co-construct knowledge. All ideas should be welcome. We shouldn't just be building knowledge from a small subset of the students. As they're working to investigate the phenomena and working to solve problems, they should be engaged in authentic science and engineering practices. And if they're engaged in all of these things, that will position them with agency and authority, because if they're engaging in the phenomena and that's what's driving the instruction, everybody has a shared experience, so they can speak with authority about that phenomenon. As they're investigating it, they're generating their own data, making their own observations with agency. So this is how this would show up in the classroom. I know this sounds to me like very familiar. It's very much like NGSS, but that makes sense because NGSS's foundation really is coming from an equity perspective. But now we can get more into like, where does the language fit in this sense making? Next slide, please. So what they're proposing is that it gets back to that foundational principle that we need to think about language in science differently. So we don't want to have just language specific tasks that aren't helping students meet their the science learning goals. But next slide, please. We want to really integrate that language instruction so that they're developing language proficiency around the science sense making. And so as they are laying out how this might look in the classroom, they came up with 4 categories of language use during science instruction. And this just happens to be a list, but there's no order or anything to them. So when they're expressing ideas, that is informal communication. That would be maybe when they're engaging in that anchoring phenomenon right at the beginning of the lesson, or even just making observations during an investigation. So this would be that maybe that I wonder and I notice portion of the lesson. And you can imagine this, the language and communication here would be relatively informal. Then the co-constructing ideas. This is where students are making sense based on data, and more like their data that they've collected. And so this could be, they could be doing this individually, in pairs, small groups, and as part of a whole class building of consensus. Excuse me. Then when they're interpreting ideas, this is when they're working on things like, it could be interpreting reading, but diagrams, graphs, and the supports they need to do that, and then take those ideas and transfer them to make sense of science. So this is where our supports are going to fall in a lot, because our media will fall into this category. And then all 3 of these types of communication are relatively informal. So you can imagine kids using lots of gestures, perhaps translanguaging, just little bits of phrases, nothing super formal. But then at some point, excuse me, there is some kind of more formal assessment or formal communication of their understanding. And at this point, you would expect things like complete sentences and maybe paragraphs in order to communicate their ideas. And so the idea behind this is to really help students understand that that language has different roles as they're going through and experiencing in science class, and make explicit what the expectations are in these different forms of communication. And so by doing this, this will help them build proficiency in language and be able to adapt in different uses. Next slide, please. So kind of talked at you a lot. So now we're just going to see Annie, who you're going to hear from later. This is her several years ago when she was teaching 2nd grade. So we're just going to see, excuse me, a little bit of her instruction. So while you're watching it, see if you can see any of the pillars of sense making and the different types of language use, and see if you can find them and just note them in the chat. Can you play the video, please?
Have you ever seen the wind move something? Have you guys ever seen the wind move anything?
Like signs?
You've seen the wind move signs sometimes? The weather unit from PBS Learning Media is really about getting students to understand the factors that produce weather. I can tell when they're engaged because of the way that they're looking. And I ask questions after they've seen the video. What does it look like outside when it's windy? Anais? How do I know it's windy?
Maybe if you could see if you see the trees moving.
I want you to circle some clues or evidence that you see that shows wind. How do you know just from looking at this picture that there's some wind happening, right? Because we can't really see it on, we can't feel it on the picture. So who would like to come up and circle one of their clues? Now remember, Can you just circle the clue and walk away? Or should you explain how you know that that shows wind? Explain. So let's see, who would like to go? Amanda, you've been doing such a great job. Come on up. I think being able to use media opens them up. What did you circle?
An acorn.
So Amanda circled an acorn. If you agree with Amanda, do a quick thumbs up. The PBS learning media really helps students that aren't understanding the language as well, because it has that visual that ties in with the language. Why did you circle the acorn?
Because it's rolling.
So how does that show you wind?
Because acorns can't move by itself.
An acorn wouldn't move by itself, right? Excellent job. And who would?
So there's a lot going on there in a really short time. We saw Annie engage her students with a phenomenon that was familiar to the students. Not an abstract question of what is wind, but where have you seen evidence of wind, or what were the effects of wind? We saw them engage in a practice where they're looking for evidence to support a claim that it's windy in that image. And she even, because she asked why it's evidence, then that's reasoning. So they've done the full arc in second grade of claim evidence reasoning. Different types of communication, their gestures, there's informal, thumbs up, thumbs down, as they're trying to build consensus. Students can work alone, and then they work in a big group. So all of these things are building a community where students are free to share their ideas and make sense of science. Next slide, please.
Have you?
Okay, so now I'm going to give a few more examples of resources from the collection that can help English learners. First thing is can help them understand how to engage in science practices. We have both live action and some PEEP animated videos where friends kind of model science practices. So the kids or the characters, they're out there making observations and asking questions and carrying out investigations. So if students are having a hard time reading or understanding instructions, by watching some of these videos and watching these students or these kids model the types of activities that you want them to do, can give students confidence to actually engage in these practices. Next slide, please. If your students are readers, the videos have transcripts that come with them. And so there's one column with English and one with Spanish, so they can make that connection. Next slide, please. For this particular resource, there's a handout where they're going to work in groups and categorize different liquids in containers according to transparent, or whether they're transparent, translucent, or opaque. Those are pretty big words. So if that doesn't work, we've got the definitions right there for them if they need them. And even if that's not enough, there are visual examples of each of them, so students can figure out how to categorize the different objects. And so this is a very UDL approach, so students can get whatever they need, and all from the same resource. Next slide, please. This resource kind of is an illustration of ways that we help students learn how to interpret media. Can you play the video, please? So this is images over 31 years of a delta. And at first, you can just have students make observations and see what they see. This is a perfect time for just I notice and I wonder type of activity. Once it's played through once, then we go in and kind of can focus them on their observations. This is what the delta is. And then give them some language and define what each of these things are, and give them some language to communicate about as they are observing later. So now they're empowered, they can watch again and really focus in on the phenomenon and be able to communicate about the changes that they're seeing. Some resources have it integrated into the video, and others have a separate handout that goes along with the visualizations. Next slide, please. Other ways that we help students interpret media are with these student inquiry assignments. And what they are activities with just short reading at the beginning that just have just a couple sentences about what it is they're looking at, why they should care about what they're looking at, which how it relates to their lives or stuff they've already learned in class. And then any information they need that would help them interpret it, where the data came from, maybe a little more information about the keys, and that type of stuff. Following that are questions that get progressively more complex, so students can start putting ideas together as they interpret the media and find relationships. Next slide, please. This is one of the handouts that we have translated. And again, we have two columns, one in English, one in Spanish, so that students can make those connections across the languages. Next slide, please. And since a lot of students' native language is not Spanish, can make a version of this in any language by plugging in the text in the left-hand column and putting it into a translation program. Next slide, please. This is the same, from the same resource. It is a question later down in that handout, but there are a couple versions. So it's exactly the same expectations for the students, but the one on the top has just some sentence starters to help students who need that little bit of extra support in order to communicate their ideas. Next slide, please. Most of what we talked about so far is more text-based. I really feel like I need to mention discourse because it's so important in the science classroom. In the STEM for EL site that you'll also find in the resource sheet that we'll send out with the link to the webinar tomorrow. They have these really nice descriptions of strategies and discourse moves. I know when I was working with pre-service teachers, that was something they really would stress about, how to lead these types of discussions, sense-making discussions, and without pushing kids to get to the right answer and let them do it themselves. But then to go along with this, there's also corresponding student discourse moves. So the students know what you expect when you're trying to do something. And so this way you can really build that community of sense making within the classroom. Next slide, please. This is really valuable for English learners because it can be intimidating to speak in these like full class discussions. So really having defined expectations for different roles in different parts of a lesson will really help alleviate that and help them build confidence and be able to share their ideas. This in green is the part that was being tested by the researchers, but then they were testing it in an elementary school. Can you please advance? And the teachers there felt it was too advanced. So they also have a version that for younger students. And you can see there are parallels, but much simpler language. So I encourage you to check both out, and hopefully you can find some of it will be useful for you. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, the last two design principles. Number 7 is all about just recognizing that all students bring a lot into the classroom, and what they bring can be considered an asset, even if it's from a different culture and different language. And because of that, students may have different ways of knowing, but sometimes that can be a really good, useful thing that everybody can build understandings off of. And this is also something that will link to our framework for diversity and equity. And then finally, the last design principle goes back to that whole idea that as students expand their language and science repertoires, they're also going to be able to just build their language proficiency and their understandings of science, and ultimately be able to both communicate their ideas in a better way, in new ways, and to express more complex ideas. Next slide, please. So this is just a question I want to pose. If there's anything that you hear tonight, what is one thing that you might want to try with your students, either in the next week or so, either something that I say or what you're going to hear from Annie and Ryan. So that's it for me. So I'm going to turn it over to Annie, and she can tell you more in detail about some of our resources.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Annie Venegas. You guys all got to see me in the video, 8 months pregnant. So that's always great. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? So I wanted to start us off with a question. Why does a linguistically diverse lens matter when teaching science? So I want to give you guys about a minute to kind of come up with your thoughts, and please put them in the chat. Okay, so do you guys need a little bit more time, or we can continue? So I just wanted to share with you guys why it matters to me, or my thoughts on it. So to me, science is a unifier. It doesn't matter your socioeconomic status, your linguistic status, right? Any student can access science, and it's up to the teachers, it's up to us to create dynamic lessons and to use lessons that make content accessible and comprehensible. We are tasked to create different ways for our students to participate that do not always revolve around reading and writing, right? Okay, next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how I support ELs in science education in my classroom. And so one of the things that I do is I like to activate background knowledge. And I do that by pre-teaching what I'm planning on teaching. So in the next slides, what you guys are going to see is that I was doing more lessons on daily weather and season. And so one of the things that I did do is I went back, I pulled my group that I knew would need some help with the language. And by using other books and videos, some from BUAC and PBS Learning Media, and from other resources, I loaded their background knowledge. I activated the background knowledge so that when the lesson started, they had something to pull out of. I also use a lot of visuals. As we know, visuals are incredibly important when you are not very familiar with the language. So I have charts and pictures. I bring in realia. I put pictures next to vocabulary. Talking about vocabulary, one of the things that I like to do is I like to pick limited content specific vocabulary. So I don't want to give them 20 new words for a unit or a lesson that I want to teach. I want to limit it to maybe 5 so that it's not, so it doesn't burden them. And so I have to be very specific with what I'm choosing. I like to match the vocabulary with pictures so that they can have a better understanding. And I like to teach the language in the context. I remember when I started out before 14 years ago, sometimes I would just kind of isolate the language, but that really didn't help them. So I'd liked to teach the language within the context. And another thing that I find important is really allowing for multiple response formats. So not just saying, okay, well, now you have to write your answer, but allowing them to submit drawings as a way of showing that they understand the topic. Partner work, they might not be able to do the writing, right, necessarily, but they can still share their thoughts and help their group progress in the project that they're doing, allowing for oral responses. And now with half my students being virtual, more videos that they can make videos and post them on Google Classroom and take pictures of the work that they're doing as well. Next slide, please. So I wanted to go into the resources that BUAC has that makes content accessible for ELs. So the resource that I used was daily and seasonal weather. And I'd like to point out that they do have the toggle between English and Spanish, and a student you can assign this to a student, this interactive lesson, and the student can toggle between both languages no matter what page they are. So if they start off in English and then decide, ooh, you know what, I kind of need that clarified, they can toggle into Spanish and it'll go into Spanish, so they don't have to start and stay in one language. Another thing that's important to note is that every page has a glossary. So the glossary goes with them. They can click on the glossary and out pops, content specific language. And they'll have, some of them do have pictures. The other thing that I really like too for a lot of my students is that it does read it out loud to them in English and Spanish. So they can click on the little icon of the mouth and it will read it out loud for them. So that again kind of takes the pressure off of them having to read. I have a student who speaks Spanish and mom, but doesn't read Spanish. So with a resource like this, it was nice that he was able to just listen to it and still be part of the class and class discussions. The other thing you'll notice are highlighted words throughout the resource. The student can click on that and out will pop the definition of the word. So they don't necessarily always have to go to the glossary. There might be a word that they're like, oh, what does that mean? And they can click on it, understand it, and move through so that their reading isn't disrupted. Another thing that I really like too is the Visualize It tool. So I've used this again with with plenty of my students that don't master the English language or even the Spanish language. And in this Visualize It tool, I can ask the student, well, how do you know that the weather is this way? And they can go in and they can circle. So again, it's giving them a different response format. They can also take notes in the bottom. They can type in their notes right then and there, which you can have access to as well. Another thing that I really like about the resources are that they do offer short, clear, and very concise videos. For EL students, this is also really important because you want things to be as clear and concise so that they can just focus on the topic that you want. I've used this video, What is Climate, with my students for a couple of years, and it's been a really big hit. They really do get to understand the difference between weather and climate. The other thing that I do want to point out is that it does have a teacher guide. And I think it's great because it also lists questions and misconceptions that your students might have. It can clarify information for teachers. The first time I was looking through some of these resources, I was looking through and I was like, oh, I just want to make sure I'm saying the right thing. And so I would go in and I'm like, oh, okay, I get it, for certain things. I have sometimes also gone back to second grade material and used that to help some of my students to build up their background knowledge and also to clarify any misconceptions that they might have. The next slide, please. So in my classroom, we did daily season and weather. And one of the things, my ultimate goal was I wanted my students to come up with ways, with a functioning definition for weather and for climate. As we know, even adults sometimes say, confuse the two. So I thought for me, it was really important for them to understand the difference. And that's where that video came in play. So how I started off my unit was we spoke about weather, we did the interactive lesson, and then my students created daily weather journals. And there's an example of one. So every day, my students would put in, what the weather felt like, what the temperature, any observations that they did, and we would discuss that. And I live in a different place than my students. So this was done virtually. And so we would have that discussion like, well, how come where you are, it's this way? And how come where I am, it's this way? So it was fun. Then we moved into climate, and my students studied different climate zones, and they picked one that they wanted to visit, and they created a travel brochure based on what they've learned about it. And I love engineering. And so I tied in an engineering project where my students went through the whole engineering process, and they had to design a house that could withstand extreme weather. And they chose their extreme weather that they wanted to study. And, our school, we have Mayan, which is a digital library. And so the students would go on there and pick. I made baskets of like floods and tornadoes and things like that. And they would pick, I had books in English and Spanish, and they would read to learn what they were like. And then they created their own houses, and then they tested them. And so the first picture of the wooden house, that was a student that's hybrid, so he comes into my class. The other picture was a virtual student, and he tested the whole thing, and his mom was holding the laptop. I couldn't put the video because there's his name and things like identifying markers, but the mom was holding the laptop and he was filling up the tub, and all the kids were like, oh my gosh, this is happening, but it's moving. And so it naturally led to this conversation of, well, what's going to be your next step? And he's like, an anchor, I have to build an anchor. So it was really great. And with the wooden house, one of the things that I love about it is that it shows that science is for everybody. And I say that because this student came in and he was so proud of himself. And he said, my daddy helped me, my mommy helped me, my sister, we all came in and we put all the things together. They got my idea. And it just shows how science is for everybody, whether you are in third grade or whether you are an adult and a parent. It just brings everyone together. And so now they're like, yeah, we were talking about this and how this was going to work. And so my parents were so excited. So I like the idea of bringing science home as well, so that parents start kind of getting used to science and showing kids that there's science everywhere. But yeah, so that was great. And a lot, again, the resources that BUAC has have been great. They have really helped because I can put them virtually and I can put them live in my class. And so through the use of video and everything, my kids are communicating. Okay, so I hope you guys got a couple of things from there. Thank you. And I'm gonna hand it off to Ryan.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. My name is Ryan Johnson. I'm a science teacher at Hogiti Dar Elementary School, which is in the Gage Park neighborhood on the southwest side of Chicago. We're a K-8 school that serves over 500 students with a significant number of English learners. So uniquely, Chicago Public Schools is making some strides to improve teaching and learning for ELs, and has made partnerships with many universities in the city to make ESL and bilingual endorsements accessible and affordable. And while we're not there yet, and we're probably not really on the right path yet, we're certainly pointed in the right direction. And one thing that I think a lot about in my practice is making sure that students have all the tools that they need to succeed. For ELs, that means that they might need a couple extra tools in the toolbox to be successful. So in your least favorite teacher fashion, I have a pop quiz for you all. On the next slide is a word puzzle. When you've solved it, please post the answer in the chat, and I'm only going to give you 10 seconds. So it's not easy to solve the code, even if you know what the language is. Like, I showed this slide to my second period class, and a student blurted about, but I don't know Morse code. So even knowing that it's Morse code, unless we have the right tools, we can't make progress on this. So here's the key. You click once. And again, please post in the chat when you solve the message. Again, you only get 10 seconds. Right? Like, even when we have the puzzle and we have the code and the key, it's still not easy to decode the message in a relevant or meaningful way. We need more scaffolding and supports to help ourselves along. So if you click one more time, now see if you can solve the code. There you go, right? And it's science. And it's amazing. Like, it's really incredible, as Annie said, that science is a unifier. Any student can access science. It's up to the teachers to create dynamic learning experiences using lessons to make the content accessible and comprehensible. I'll also add that it's up to us to provide the correct scaffolding for students so they can feel empowered to figure out the science and language codes on their own. You know, Bob mentioned it in the comments earlier, of like claim and evidence and reasoning. They need to construct that for themselves. All right, go ahead. Which leads me directly to my BUAC resource, which is called Code to Picture. So Sean and Annie already pointed out a lot of the great features of these resources. And one thing I want to reiterate is something Sean said, and that these support all kinds of ELs, just not Spanish speakers. Often EL conversations focus primarily around Spanish, which makes sense given a lot of the school populations. But these resources support learners of all languages. Denise had said in the comments that, you know, translation can be challenging. So we kind of can get around that by using the strategies here as a great way to encourage learning English and science in a meaningful, authentic way. One of the great things the BUAC resources do is they help these students create a sense of self, which is that they can create and build a positive science identity for themselves. They participate in equitable engagement where they all can access the material. They practice effective language development, and they're constantly performing on formative assessments for feedback. So they're constantly getting that affirmative feedback loop in order to improve. In Code to Picture, students can use the bilingual interactive to actually figure out the code of the picture and how that can be used to develop one kind of language, which is computer science and binary code. And I can already like see the wheels turning and the chat going, and like, no, you're not going to be teaching Python or Java to 8-year-olds, but this is laying the groundwork so that maybe they can start to learn those languages in middle school or high school. Annie said this actually before the session, like, you'll be surprised what they can do. Don't underestimate your students. You know, we can challenge them, and through these inquiry-based activities, we can really help them build meaning for themselves. Next slide. So the tool in Code to Picture shows how computers make pictures with code. As you can see, the picture appears on a grid and they correspond to the binary code in the black box on the right. Either a square is black and represented by a 0 or white and represented by a 1. The squares in the grid help make the picture. The interactive can be used to create the duck, as you can see on the left side there, or you can create unique pictures and pair them with a paper pencil activity. So kind of like Diana asked, are these like for in-person or remote? You can do it either way. Students can make the picture first or the code first, and then see how one leads to the other. Now it's not shown, but the next activity that is linked in with this resource is a battleship-esque exercise where students develop a coded picture in binary language and their partner has to determine the visual. It's kind of like the Morse code example where the EL lens we're looking through helps students learn science and language simultaneously. And it really levels this playing field as all the students are learning the language of computers, the language of science, and English language at the same time. All right, next slide. So one of the greatest hurdles I've seen in teaching K-5 science is that many teachers don't have much formal science training, and that's fine. But what it means is that teachers are going to have to build their own understanding on the job. Unfortunately, at least here in Chicago, we have a lot of PD on reading and a lot of PD on math, but very little on science and social studies unless a teacher seeks it out for themselves. And you all being here are clearly doing that, which is fabulous. All the BUAC resources, not just Code to Picture, offer extensive teacher support. Like, I don't know about you, but I didn't grow up learning computer science, much less expect that I would have to teach it. So this is really, really appreciated that I can feel comfortable introducing something to my students for the first time. There are tons of excellent resources for teachers, so you don't feel uncomfortable teaching these unknown subjects. The resources from Code to Picture, which are shown here, can be used for your students, but they can also serve to help you build your background so that you feel comfortable teaching, even if it's not your area of expertise. And that's okay, right? Like, it's not about you, it's about the students and how they build the understanding and language for themselves. Really going into what Sean was saying about the NGSS, it's really about students making meaning. And Code to Picture exemplifies the belief that science is meaningful when students build and expand their identities as capable learners, which is hugely important for ELs. Science is their chance to be right on the same level as their peers because the concepts and language are new to everybody, like maybe even you. BUAC resources can build efficacy and confidence in students that they construct meaning through affirmative, positive experiences. Next slide. And I mean, really what we know is that students learn best when they're able to expand their science and language repertoires simultaneously. Research has shown that, a lot of the research here. Science instruction is at its best when students have the opportunity to explore ideas and questions that leverage a broad range of language resources. Multiple modalities help students expand their range of language and enable the expression of more complex ideas, increase precision, and shifts in purpose and tone. You know, Code to Picture fully embraces these understandings by offering students the chance to learn language codes by engaging in computer coding. They're learning the 3 languages at once: binary, science, and English. It's really, really exciting to be a science teacher in 2021. Our classrooms are diverse, our standards are improved, there are more resources available than ever before. And I really believe teaching ELs is not a hurdle, it's an opportunity. All students must learn the language of science so we can offer the tools to ELs, but everybody benefits from these things as they learn English and science simultaneously. You know, again, a lot of the research really done here by the BUAC team shows that students are learning science and language like never before, never more true than in this remote environment with some students learning in person, some remote, some hybrid, some both at the same time. But as long as the practices are there and the scaffolding is there and students are supported by great resources like these, the future looks really bright. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Wow. What a rich presentation. Your enthusiasm and skill, Ryan and Annie, is just infectious. And I really appreciate your participation tonight. And the way that you use the resources is very heartening to the whole production and editorial team who has been so deeply involved in these resources. So thank you very much. Okay, just a couple of closing remarks. We'll have the presenters look through the chat if there are some things that they can respond to. If we are not able to get to you in the chat and you do have questions, we will post them. We will get in touch with you individually. So just a reminder that the resources you saw tonight live on pbslearningmedia.org, the free site that has thousands of resources, not just for science. I assume that many of you are early grade teachers and you teach other subjects. PBS Learning Media is a go-to site for you for other subjects also, but we are very strong in science. These are just some examples of collection banners of other collections on the site. Bringing the Universe is the one we've been speaking about. Wild Kratts and Nature Cat, Plum Landing, Molly of Denali, Curious George. You'll have links to all of these on that resource document that we've been talking about. And maybe Angelica is able to post them in the chat also. So we run a lot of webinars at GBH, and I think that some of you have probably been to more than one of our webinars, and thank you. We appreciate it. We recently ran a series of 4 that were grade specific on integrating media into science instruction that were not specifically for EL students, but you might certainly benefit from if you were able to attend or watching the recording. All of our recordings live on the GBH Education YouTube channel, and we post everything there a day or so after the event. So coming up on Thursday is the last one on the list, and that's for grade 6-12, and it will be a revised presentation from tonight. On April 1st, we are hosting a webinar on project-based learning. We've done something similar in the past, but this has a very different spin to it, based on everything that we have learned through distance learning and project-based learning. And the 2 main speakers are experts in the field of project-based learning. One of them is Susie Boss, who is an author and on the faculty of PBL Works. There will also be a teacher on the call. So if you have an interest, this is appropriate for all grades and subjects. And if you have an interest, there's the registration link to that. All right, please help us do better and make our webinars better. This is the link to a very brief survey. At the end of the survey, you can download a certificate that acknowledges your participation this evening. The survey will remain open for a week, and if you have any issues looking at it or getting into it, or you need more time or whatever, just give me a shout out. As we mentioned, tomorrow you will be getting an email. It comes out from Zoom, and it comes out about the same time of the day as the webinar. So it'll be tomorrow evening, and that will include the link to the recording for tonight, the slides, the resource document, and also the survey. But meanwhile, if you have any questions or comments, please contact me, Carolyn_Jacobs at WGBH.org. You will get a response from me, and anything that you find on the site that you are more curious about, have questions about it, any issues, you need to get on our mailing list, whatever, let me know. All right, I think we are right at the end of our time. Oh my goodness, we're a couple minutes over, I apologize. So I'm going to keep the chat open for another couple of minutes and wish you a wonderful evening, and thank Annie and Ryan and Sean and also Angelica in the chat. Thank you again. Thank you. Good night, everybody.